Hey everyone, welcome to our week 2 virtual class. You're going to need a few things for this class. It's kind of a video presentation lecture, but if you get your sketchbook and your pencil ready, and you may also have the crayon I gave you in class. I hope I remember to do that. And a cell phone that you might use as a timer or a camera during these activities. And it's also a pretty long presentation, so you'll have to pause and take some breaks whenever feels right for you, and you can also pause and get those materials when you need them. Let's get started. So in each of the 4 arts, there are kind of core elements that are kind of the foundation of the subject, the theory of that particular art form. Today we're going to focus on the elements and principles of visual art, and I just want you to know that there are equivalents in movement, drama, and music that we're not going to get into today, but I've put links here in the PowerPoint that you can follow to learn more about a specific subject. In the PEI Arts curriculum, there are 4 strands. The first of these 4 strands is called fundamental concepts, and in the curriculum documents this will often be in parentheses as FC. That's pretty much what we're talking about, is strand 1 from the arts curriculum. And in the curriculum documents it's called strand 1 or fundamental concepts. I think that language is kind of hard to remember sometimes, so you may also want to remember these exact same equivalent ideas, just the idea of art theory, which is the language we use pretty commonly in the art world to talk about these ideas, or the elements of art and the principles of design, which is the classroom language that's applied throughout the curriculum and also the language we're going to use today. These mean the same things, and I just think it's important to clarify that language. I also want to underline a word of caution. Though familiarity with these elements is totally essential in order to understand and read the curriculum documents, I just want to remember that point from the reading we had on the Introduction to Art Education, that these vocabulary words are useful when we think and talk and make art. But they have become disproportionately foundational ideas in the arts curriculum. And I guess what I mean by that is that an overemphasis on theory can make your lessons less meaningful. And I would always recommend creating a larger art project or an integrated art project with another curriculum subject and highlighting the theory, the elements and principles as you make your project, but not centering lessons around the elements and principles. Today we're going to do activities that are really centered around elements and principles, and that's okay too, but it's just not as engaging a way to learn about art, and especially in an elementary school classroom. I just want you to be mindful of overemphasizing theory. Though it's important, it's not everything, and it's often not as meaningful to the learner. So we're going to start by looking at the elements of art. There are 7 elements of art. Sometimes you will see 6, because people combine color and value. Today we're going to keep them separate because both are very important ideas. The first element of art that we're going to look at today is line. So line is super important. We can find it in all types of art. Essentially, when you make a mark on paper, you're making a line. And there are actually many different kinds of lines and styles of lines. Line can be thick or thin or shaky or tapered. All of these things communicate in an artwork. A contour line is like the outside of an object. An implied line is where there's no actual line, but like imagine like a landscape and there's a horizon line and there's a color change along that line. So it's when we see a line, though there's not just a single simple line has been drawn there. A psychic line is something that we imagine as like pointing. When we point, you know, I mean this direction, and that's a psychic line. So though there's no actual physical line there, you understand pointing and will look in the direction that I'm pointing. My cat can't understand psychic lines. I'm always pointing at the cat toy. No dice, just looking at my finger. 2D and 3D lines. So sculptures also have lines. So it's important to remember the branches of a tree could appear like a line. Let's do an activity to practice making lines. So in your sketchbook, get your sketchbook and your pencil. I would love for you to take, let's say, 2 minutes if you have your timer. If you're someone who works quickly, you might not want to bother timing yourself. If you're someone who works slowly, I recommend using your timer for these activities. Otherwise, this lecture might turn into a very, very long affair. If you give yourself a little too long on each activity, there's a lot of activities. So let's say for 2 minutes, I want you to draw a continuous line, by which I mean don't lift your pencil. And I want you to try to tell with your line the story of a typical day in your life. So if you're working in your little sketchbook, you may want to sort of spiral around and use the space in creative ways because it's not a very big page. Yeah, I think that's it. Just think of your day. Think of your day as a continuous line and try to draw that out. I'm going to pause now. You may want to pause while you draw also. Okay, I'm going to continue on. Please, of course, keep all these activities in your sketchbook, and I'll be checking them later on at the end of the class. The next element we're going to look at is shape. And so whenever a line moves around a page and crosses over itself, it becomes a shape. And shapes are two-dimensional, and they can be roughly categorized into two main categories, which are organic shapes and geometric shapes. And organic shapes are like freeform or regular, think pear-shaped, or like a lot of the natural occurring shapes we see in nature. Whereas geometric shapes tend to be sharper, triangles, rectangles, man-made products. The circle is always a confusing category here, and the circle is sort of both organic and geometric. So we won't worry too much about that. But if you think sharp and smooth, you get sort of the mood that is underlined by different types of shape. Here's a second activity today. I want you to draw 2 really quick sketches of this outline of this woman by just stacking simple shapes. I sort of put a little sketchy thing in the side there so you understand what I'm looking for. In the first sketch, I want you to try to make your tower of shapes all out of geometric shapes. So really rigid, sharp corners that make up the outline of this figure. And in your second sketch, I want you to try the exact same figure again, the same outline made of simple shapes, but this time try making more organic shapes. Maybe like looking at the shapes that are there and smoothing them out and making them a bit more freeform. So again, do this pretty quickly, and we're not looking for a very sophisticated drawing, just simple shapes. And again, just probably 2 or 3 minutes on this activity. The next element of art is texture. Texture is the way things feel, as you know. And that can be rough or smooth or bumpy. If you think of all the different materials we have in the world, they all have very different textures. An important idea in visual art is that texture can be actual texture or it can be implied. And that's how something looks. So even in a drawing, you can create a texture or the illusion of a texture. Hatching, where you sort of cross lines over top of each other, is a common way of creating texture in a drawing. For this activity, we're going to pull in the peeled crayon and try doing the classic activity of a texture rubbing. And that is when you set a sheet of paper on top of a textured item. Maybe I'll use the spiral of my book here. And you just rub your crayon. I need a better, I need a tripod. Just rubbing my crayon on its texture. Here, let me get that on a white surface. Rubbing my crayon and getting a result. It's really fun to explore your space. See what you can find, what textures you can find around your house. You may want to pause the video. When you're done rubbing your texture, I would love to play a texture guessing game. We normally do this in person, so let's see if we can replicate it online. Just take a quick photo of your texture rubbing and upload it to this link. I'll put all the links at the end of the video. I'm not sure if you can click through them in this format or not. I'll make sure I have them posted with the video. Go into this photo gallery, upload your texture here, and then look at one or two other people's textures and hit the respond to this photo. It's like a little speech bubble box, and try to guess on a few textures. Let's see if we can figure out each other's textures. You may want to pause this video. I'm going to continue on. Our next element of art is space. Space is the room around a work of art. It's also important. It really affects it. And also the space taken up by the work of art. So I put a picture here. You see the hands making a heart, and that's a really great indication. In this picture, the hands are the positive space. They're the actual space being taken up by the subject. And the empty area that's making the heart, or the border around the hands, that's called negative space, sort of the holes. And the holes and the emptiness are actually really important when we understand artworks. And so we need to have a word for that, and the word is negative space. So our activity connected to space is going to be a drawing activity. This is actually a really common observation activity. And I've got essentially a picture of a bench here, and with it a picture that somebody has already made of the negative spaces around the bench. And whichever one you find easier to focus on is fine, or you can go back and forth between the two. But I want you to try making your own sketch of the negative spaces around this bench. So instead of trying to draw the bench itself, this is what I was talking about in class, like reprogramming your brain to see what is actually there, not what you think is there. Because we have preconceived notions of what a bench looks like, our brain will fill in information when we try to draw the bench. But if we try to draw the empty holes instead of drawing the bench, our brain has no preconceived notions about that empty space. So that's actually a great trick when learning to draw realistically, is to look at the empty spaces instead of the object. And so look for their shape, Look for the angle of the shape, look for the overlaps and the relationships, the proportions of the shapes. Those are all things to do while you draw the negative space. You can pause the video to take a minute or two to try drawing that negative space. Our next element of art is form. Form is the 3D counterpart to shape. So remember I underlined that shape is two-dimensional. Form is three-dimensional. Illusory form, illusionary form, is created by using perspective techniques like shading and perspective to show form on a 2D work. So just the same way as we can have implied texture, we can also sort of fake the idea of form. It's not real form, but when we look at the image, we've created the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional plane. And then of course there's actual form. So when you work in sculpture, you may actually talk about the 3-dimensional shapes you're seeing and how they take up space and what the effects of that form is. If it looks heavy, if it looks light, if it looks delicate, those kinds of ideas. For this activity, I want you to transform your page and just take 5 minutes and just think of a way to turn your piece of paper, a piece of paper. You can rip a page out of your sketchbook or use any piece of like garbage paper that you have laying around and transform your page. So turn it into something that has form, something 3-dimensional. And I have a sort of like cheat sheet of what that might mean to transform a page. But again, set your timer for 5 minutes and just transform your page. You could pause the video now. So before we carry on with our next element of art, I want to hit pause, and I would love for you to reflect in your sketchbook just what was different about that last activity, about the form activity. And I don't know if this is what you said, but what I'm thinking of is for that activity, I didn't give you really specific constraints or parameters. My instructions were really vague. I really left it open to you how you wanted to transform your page. And that's kind of a common issue in art lessons, and there's good and bad with a lack of constraints. I would love for you to just reflect, take a minute, and think about what are the pros and cons of giving constraints and structure in art activities. So take a minute, reflect, write that in your journal, pause the video. Okay, moving on. Our next element of art, arguably the most influential, highest impact of the elements, is color. So I'm just going to roll through a lot of important color vocabulary here so that you sort of see an overview of what's included in the theory of color, or color theory. So we all know our primary colors, and of course also our secondary colors. But less known and also important vocabulary is tertiary colors. And those are the colors that are made by mixing our primaries and secondaries. And tertiary colors are always labeled with the primary color first. And so that's an easy way to remember if it's red-orange or blue-green, for example. Another important color theory vocabulary is the idea of warm and cool colors. And warm and cool colors are often associated with mood. So warm colors, you can think the colors of the sun, and they're usually associated with being bold and vibrant and energetic. And cool colors are colors of the night or of the water, the blues, purples, and greens, and they are usually associated with being more soothing, calming, and subtle. Some more color vocabulary is analogous colors, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So red and orange are analogous colors, or complementary colors. Those are colors that make contrast. They're opposite each other on the color wheel. So red and green are complementary colors. Yellow and purple are complementary colors. Blue and orange are complementary colors. An important idea when we think about color theory is that colors react to each other visually. And so they look different depending which color they're put next to. And here's a great little graphic I found online to illustrate that. Here we have the exact same green 2 times, and does it ever look different on a red background or a yellow background? And also we have the exact same yellow, but the text really pops differently if you choose an analogous green for your text or a more contrasting blue for your text. Another idea, and I'm really skimming the surface of these ideas, I just sort of want you to know the scope of what's included in color theory, is the idea of intensity. So it's like some colors are stronger than other colors, and we use the word intensity to talk about that. We're not going to do a color activity today because we are going to do one in week 2 in-person class. We're going to do some color mixing, which again is a really important idea in painting, and it's also important in the classroom, certainly in the later elementary years, learning to make muted colors and the full spectrum of colors by mixing your colors together. Our last element that we're going to look at today is value. So value is referring to how light or how dark a color is. And that subtle change in value is what helps us create the illusion of depth in drawing. So let's look at that a little bit more carefully. So when we want to make a shaded shape, we use value gradations that follow the form of that shape to create shading and shadows, and that's how we create the illusion of depth on a 2D surface. I won't say too much about it, but here's a great example from M.C. Escher, and I love using this picture to talk about value and the illusion of depth because we can see the part of the drawing that's been shaded looks realistic, and the part that hasn't been shaded still looks less realistic, looks like an outline, like a contour drawing. So just because we didn't have enough vocabulary going yet, when we talk about value in colors, we have 2 more words. We can either say a tint or a shade. So a tint is whenever you're adding white to a color, so you're making it lighter. So pink is not actually a color, pink is a tint. And shades are when you darken a color or make it, give it a darker value. Whew, it was a lot of vocabulary. Let's take an activity break, and I'd love for you to make a 5-value scale in your sketchbook. And please do this, you can do this quite small so that it doesn't take you very much time. There's a lot of activities today. And one of those 5 squares, so you can just draw 5 little squares in a row like I have in the picture here. And one of them you're going to leave completely white. That's your lightest value on your value scale. And at the other end, you're going to color as hard as you can with your pencil and get your darkest value on your value scale. Now the work is creating 3 different values in between your lightest and your darkest that slowly change in value. So you want to make sure that You've got your darkest, and right next to that is your medium dark, and then you have your kind of medium light, and then you have your lightest shading, and then you have your white square. You can pause the video. When you're done doing your 5-value scale, I want you to try making a continuous gradation right next to your value scale. And this is an important technique. It's the ability to very slowly, with your pencil, create a smooth gradation where one value fades into another without seeing the line where it fades. So I call that a gradual gradation. And so you're trying to make a value scale and fade from your darkest to lightest without a visible line. So you're getting a smooth gradation in your value. And that's going to allow technical shading. That's the hardest part of shading, is getting a smooth gradation. You can pause the video while you do that. Okay, so we've met our 7 elements of art, and now I'd like to introduce you to our principles of design, or principles of art. This language is used interchangeably. Here's a metaphor that I like to use to remember the difference between these two things. You think of our elements of art like ingredients in an artwork, and our principles of art are like recipes. They're how we put those ingredients together to create an artwork. So I'm going to tell you a little more about that. These lists aren't definite, and you won't always encounter them the exact same, but you can remember that there are 8 principles of design, roughly, and they are ideas like balance, unity, pattern, variety, emphasis, contrast, movement, and proportion. And this, when we look at an artwork, this is the visual language that we can use to describe and understand the artwork, understand the emotion that's coming out of the artwork, how it makes us feel, and why. With, of course, the elements. So, unity. Unity, this principle means the quality of it looking like it all belongs together. It's unified. So that's achieved by usually using the elements of art in a really cohesive way. So all the same kind of colors, all the same kind of lines, all the same kind of shapes, and relationships between those elements working well. Let's look at an example. So here's a painting by a Canadian artist named Bernadette Fan, and in this painting she creates unity by using her elements in a certain way. And maybe if you can just look at the painting for a minute and think about what elements are in here and how is she using them to make them feel unified. So color is one of the first ones I identify. And I'd say that her palette is really like pastel-y. The colors are really analogous. They are, yeah, there's areas of kind of warm and cool, but those areas are sort of composed where they are in the painting. You can see that. So her colors are soft too and analogous. Her shapes are smooth and organic. I think that text is hidden behind my head, but the texture is also smooth. And the space in the composition follows what we might call a rule of thirds. I'm not going to get into that, but that's a compositional idea that space looks nice divided at lines of thirds within a composition. But the empty space, the whiter areas of this picture are important in creating a nice harmony. Our second principle is pattern or rhythm or repetition. They all sort of express the main idea, and that, of course, is the repetition of any element of art to achieve usually decoration, ornamentation, and it usually creates balance and harmony and lots of great visual interest. Let's look at some examples of repetition. So here the artist Ben Shahn has shown repetition in line. You see all those shopping carts and the little circle wheels, they repeat. We see the same kind of line throughout. Same shapes too. Here's a scorpion mola. It's from a Cuna artist from the Panama region, and it shows repetition of which elements. Which elements are repeating here? So yeah, you might have said it, but the colors repeat, the lines repeat, the shapes repeat. Let's stop for an activity. That was a lot of talk. Let's look for pattern and repetition in the space around you. So you can find either an example of a pattern, maybe a shirt or a pillowcase or something that's nearby, and sketch that pattern. Or you can look at your space and interpret something that makes sense drawn as a pattern. So I might look around my room and there's sort of these like boards on the walls. So maybe I would draw all those lines that I see on my wall. Or on my Kleenex box, I've got these little birch trees that are repeating. So just look around your space for an example of pattern or repetition to sketch. And you can pause the video while you do that. Okay, moving on to our next principle of design is balance. So balance is visually exactly as it is in the physical world. You can imagine a teeter-totter and wanting to keep weight even on both sides. The same idea applies in an artwork. There's this idea that we call visual weight, and the more visual weight something has, the more it attracts the eye in a picture. And if you see in these two examples here, we've got things that might be creating visual weight in each of the two pictures. So if you look at the shapes in the top left, the fact that the big circle is so much bigger, it's using size to create visual weight. And in the lower picture, we also have this really big dark circle in the top left corner, and it's using color and size. So it's a really dark color. Dark colors usually create more visual weight. Do you see visual weight in these pictures? I sort of ruined that question, didn't I? So we can create visual weight all sorts of ways by using color, by using movement, lines that guide our eye towards something, the size of something, by variety. If one thing is not like the others, that creates a interest, emphasis, and weight. Empty space creates a lot of weight in the positive space, as we see with this man playing piano in the bottom corner. And contrast can also create strong visual weight. I already said this, dark colors way more visually than light colors. So we're still talking about balance, but we got some subcategories when we talk about balance, and those include 4 main vocabulary words, which are symmetrical balance. So that's, of course, an important idea in math, also the idea of symmetry, and in geometry. But that's when both sides of an imaginary line down the middle are the same on either side, like looking in a mirror. We also have asymmetrical balance, and that's like when the weight on both sides of that imaginary middle line are even, but that they don't mirror each other. But the weight in the whole composition is still sort of spread out and kept even, as we see in this lino cut print. Another type of balance that we can identify is radial balance. That's when all elements radiate from the center point. And the final category or vocabulary of balance that I'll talk about today is crystallographic balance. And that's kind of like wallpaper, when visual composition is spread evenly over a whole space. Moving on, our next principle of design is proportion. And proportion talks about the relationship of size from one component to another. And it's an important idea in creating realism, but it's also an important principle for creating distortions, like we see in this example picture, that you might choose to create or exaggerate a proportion to bring emphasis, bring humor, bring whatever you like. But you see what happens when things are out of proportion. It creates a lot of interest. Here's a sculpture by Canadian artist Sherry Boyle, and here she uses proportion to make us kind of believe that these heads and bodies might belong together. You know, we know they don't, but she's creating a unity here by matching these proportions. Our next principle of design is movement. So movement is the design principle that uses the elements to just produce the effect of action, which you can really see in Leah Duran's Me Chief Horsewomen painting here. There's a lot of action in the hair of the figures, in the swirling, spiraling lines moving up through the shapes that are spiraling around the image. So movement can be literal, like we see the elements in the picture moving, but it can also talk about the way our eye moves around a picture. And an artist should be thinking about that in their composition, that the way they use their lines and shapes and composition will guide the viewer's eye. And in old classical painting, actually, that was used a lot in narrative painting. The eye would be guided in a very specific order around a painting to tell a certain story and reveal different elements. You can use light to do that. You can use line. You can use all sorts of tricks. So here's another example of movement. Emily Carr's painting called Swirl. How do you think Emily Carr is creating movement in this forest painting? So line and shape are really important again. Hey, if you look at that swoop of that tree, it's a very organic shape. It's swooping, it's soft, it's not geometric. The brush stroke is really rich and loose. The lines are very wavy. It creates a sense of movement. The colors are really quite vibrant and bleeding into each other too. That feeds the energy of the work. Let's do a movement activity. So this is a really, really classic drawing activity. It's called gesture drawing. And normally we'd be in an art room, we have a model in the middle, and the model strikes all kinds of poses for just 1 minute or 2-minute pose. And you try to draw the outline of the figure as quickly as you can to sort of capture the proportions and the movement of the body. And it's a really great activity to make you draw fast, to just look at the outline, to just look at the really basic building blocks that are in front of you, and to also think about keeping figures like light and spontaneous, which gives them the illusion of more movement in your drawing. So for this, I just linked a figure skating video pretty randomly here, but I thought you could go look at that, fast forward it a bit, pause it anywhere, and just spend a really quick amount of time drawing the outline of the body. And you may want to do that a couple times, move it to a different place, pause it, and quickly, as quick as you can, draw the outline of the body. And of course, never more than 2 minutes, but I recommend 1 minute to just get the outline as quick as you can. You can pause the video and go do that now. Okay, our next principle of design is variety. And variety is really just underlining that putting a bunch of different elements together makes a composition really interesting. So that might be using a variety of different sizes or a variety of different shapes or a different style of line. And in this particular painting, you can see that the artist has kind of a mixture of realism and then contour drawing. And so those two sort of styles of drawing are put together and layered to create sort of a variety. They're contrasting each other a little, although all the forms are pretty similar. There's sort of a different style in the colored elements and the white lines. Here's another great example. Manuel Osahor is a Canadian painter, and here you see variety kind of in the unfinished spaces around the figures. Especially you look at this region on the right that's sort of blue and it's got a sharp an outline around it. It's got like a real contrast there between the kind of blue area, the cool areas, and the warm areas, and the kind of different ways of treating shapes. So some are like the figures themselves are really quite organic, but this cutout is pretty geometric and sharper edges. So there's a variety created within still a unified work, and it sort of draws our eye there. Our next principle of design is emphasis, and that's sort of the development of a focal point in your artwork. Here's a very famous painting by artist Francisco Goya. It's called The Shootings of May 3rd, 1801. And it's a great example of emphasis. We got a lot of elements working to create emphasis here. So where would you say is the main point of emphasis in this picture, and how, what elements are creating that? So I would say the emphasis is on our man in the white shirt, and there's certainly contrast. He's by far the brightest color, and like really high contrast between him and sort of all the other value in this picture. He's much brighter. And we also have lines. Those guns are strong, what we call psychic lines, but also actual physical lines pointing towards him. This picture, when I was talking about the art practice of guiding the eye through a painting, this picture is actually a great example of that. The sort of line sort of begins at the bottom of the soldier's legs and moves as a diagonal into the picture down the gun line to our focal point. And usually, not always, but usually people notice the sort of bloody scene in the foreground later on. And it's quite shocking to see something so violent later, you know, like we'd think that would be the focal point. We would notice it right away. But the artist here is trying to use the elements to lead us through the story in a way that is very controlled. So I've been using all these words. They're all interrelated. You see that emphasis and contrast have a strong relationship. Proportion creates contrast, everything. But contrast is, of course, whenever there's differences between the elements, and that draws our attention and our eyes. And here's an example, an artwork by Jordan Bennett, Moose Calling Moon. And in this one, I just felt there was a really strong contrast in colors. So the colors in the top of the artwork are kind of like pastel-y, mixed, calm colors. And the colors in the bottom are really pure and intense and high contrasting colors. So that is, like, in a really quick nutshell, our vocabulary of the principles of design. And here, of course, they are reviewed. They sort of have subcategories. I talked about the relationships, but like pattern and repetition tend to unify a work. Balance and proportion can kind of go either way. They can be unifying or they can be adding variety, depending how you use them. And then emphasis, contrast, and movement tend to always be adding variety to a composition. So this classification is not important. It's just a way to think about these ideas and how both is important. Bringing the artwork together, making it look like it's finished and belongs together is important, but also like mixing it up and making it original is important to making it interesting and unique. So our final activity for today is leading us into our art response, but we're going to really keep our focus on the elements of art and the principles of design. And I would just love for you to look at this very famous artwork. It's called The Banjo Lesson by Henry Asawa Tanner. And see which elements of art and principles of design you can identify in this artwork. And I'd love for you to actually write that in your sketchbook. I have that in the checklist of sketchbook activities. So just take a minute and sit and look at this picture and pick out, try to remember what were the elements we learned about today and how are they in this picture, which ones are really prominent in this picture, and then the principles. Which principles are you seeing in this picture? Try to apply that vocabulary.